Welcome to another episode of Spotlight Podcast. Today I have a special guest. Dr. Michael Rees is a sociology lecturer and a social researcher at the Nottingham Trent University. His academic focus revolves around the body, covering areas such as identity, health, aging, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. Dr. Rees also explored the sociology of Norbert Elias, and he has a keen interest in social research methods, particularly the insider-outsider dynamic of ethnographic research. At the NTU, he teaches modules like Body and Society and Foundations of Social Theory. He is also a sociology course leader at Masters of Arts at NTU. His PhD, titled Authenticity and Identity, a figurational exploration of tattooing practices in the UK, founded by ESRC 1+3 grant and supervised by Professor Chris Schilling, delves into the relationship between body and identity with a specific focus on tattooing. Dr. Rees conducted extensive ethnographic research, including participants' observation in tattooing studios, music festivals, and conventions, along with 40 in-depth, semi-structured interviews. Dr. Rees holds a first-class honors degree in sociology from the University of West of England from 2007, a master's with merit in social research methods from the University of Kent 2009, and a PhD in sociology from University of Kent 2015. Today we will talk with Dr. Rees about his latest book, Tattooing in Contemporary Society, Identity and Authenticity. Dr. Rees, thank you so much for coming to Spotlight Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
At the very beginning is an icebreaker question. Can you please tell me how you end up in this field?
It may be obvious if anyone's watching rather than listening that I've got quite a lot of tattoos myself. So I had my first tattoo when I was just 17, so quite a long time ago now. A lot of the sort of bands and music I was into, I'm into a lot of rock music, and lots of the people that I would listen to had tattoos, and I thought I was quite rebellious, so I started getting tattoos at a relatively young age as a personal interest. And then I went to university. I was 22 when I started my undergraduate degree. I'd had quite a few tattoos by then, and I studied a module on the sociology of the body, which I was amazed that this was a thing you could do at the time. I'd never really realized how broad sociology was. And I really enjoyed that module. And then my undergraduate dissertation I did on body modification, so tattooing and body piercing. And then, later went back, got funding and did that as my PhD focus as well. There hadn't really been much research on tattooing in the UK. There'd been a fairly seminal study in the kind of mid to late 90s, but since then no real primary research into tattooing in the UK, so that was kind of something that I wanted to explore in my own PhD.
Exactly, this would be my alteration of the previous question. What actually you were trying to accomplish with this book, because through your literature review we can see that there is to some extent, some academics were covering this topic, but it seems that your book was having some other approach.
Yeah, so tattooing has been written about quite a lot, particularly in psychology, where it's broadly been viewed quite negatively, and similarly in criminology. And then sociology kind of turns its attention to it around the kind of mid-90s as it starts to take the body itself more seriously as a topic of investigation. But outside of Paul Sweetman's work, which was very influential on my own, most of it was from an American perspective. So really one of the things I was looking to investigate was, why are people getting tattoos? Because, when I had my first tattoo, I'm from Cardiff, which is quite a big city. There were only 3 tattoo studios at the time. And obviously I had to go to the dodgy one because I was only 17.
And this was back
This was 1999. Yeah, I had my first one. But there are, I don't know, I haven't lived in Cardiff for a long time now, but even I, from friends who still live there, could name 15 to 20 tattoo studios in the city now. So the practice had become very popular, not quite as rebellious as I thought it was when I was first getting them. And I was interested in investigating why it had become more kind of acceptable and popular, and why it was people were doing it. Why not just, dye your hair or buy a new t-shirt or whatever? What was it about tattooing that attracted people to it?
Can you tell me a little bit more about the history, which is comprises the first chapter of your book?
Yeah, so I think there's this common misconception that tattooing kind of came to Britain as a result of people like Captain Cook. So voyages to like the Pacific, very associated with kind of Samoa, Fiji, New Zealand, of course. And there's the very kind of common history in Europe is that, you know, Captain Cook and others went out, explored the world and brought the practice back to Britain. But that's not actually true. You can find evidence of tattooing throughout the history of Europe and other parts of the world. You know, there's history or evidence rather of tattooing in ancient Rome, for example. I'm not a tattoo historian, to be clear, although I do address it a little bit in the book. But we can find evidence of tattooing throughout history. It's not just this thing that was imported from kind of colonial islands, although there was an upsurge in popularity, you know, as sailors got tattoos and so forth. And broadly, again, the history of tattooing is that it was once a deviant practice. You know, the common conception of kind of sailors and criminals and prostitutes would get them, and it's only over more recent years that narrative has been challenged. But again, if you look throughout history, it's much more complicated than that. There's evidence of aristocracy and nobility getting tattoos as well.
At a certain point.
Yes.
And then I saw the shift abandoning for some time, and then...
Yeah, particularly I think the invention of the electric tattoo machine. So this allowed tattooing to be applied much more easily, with much less skill at the time, and much more cheaply. So it became much more widespread. So you see the kind of aristocracy withdraw from it at that point, I think, because it becomes more common, for lack of a better word. Again, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but I think that's broadly a kind of acceptable view, if you like. It's not as black and white as often many things aren't, but certainly the electric tattoo machine saw an uptake in popularity, and you do see tattooing become associated with criminal gangs, famously with biker gangs, you know, like the Hells Angels, and was seen as a mark of kind of disrepute for a fairly long time. And I mentioned it, the practice has a kind of long history of research in psychology and criminology, which have generally looked unfavourably on the practice, have viewed it as being either a practice associated with criminals or being a replacement for kind of other forms of psychological therapy or so forth. Although even in those disciplines, views on tattooing have challenged and changed over more recent years.
I was very amazed by certain characters that kind of took advantage through the history when tattoo art became ubiquitous in a sense. You mentioned Aleksandros, a Greek Albanian who had around 400 tattoos on his body, and he was charging around $100 per week at the end of 19th century, which was quite an amount.
Yeah, you get so you get a period, what I call the kind of fairground and circus period, where the ease of application of tattooing meant that you got lots of heavily displayed people who would display themselves as oddities, so that they'd go around with travelling circuses and fairgrounds and display themselves along with like sword swallowers and bearded ladies and so forth. Very often their stories would draw on kind of exoticism. You know, they would tell tales of being kind of forcibly tattooed by so-called primitive society.
Just to make their story a little bit interesting, compelling, I guess.
Yes, and most of those stories kind of fail under scrutiny. But certainly it was very titillating, and it kind of was sold to the audiences of the time, and particularly where there were heavily tattooed females, you know, it was an opportunity to kind of view parts of the female body that perhaps would be prohibited elsewhere.
The connection between tattooing and consumer culture is a fascinating aspect of your work. How do you see tattooing fitting into the large framework on consumer culture?
So for me, I think the shift in popularity of tattooing and the shift in acceptability, as it no longer being seen as something just for kind of criminals and deviants and so forth, is largely attributed to consumer culture. So I published an article on this, and it's also a chapter in the book. I look at some of the reasons why I think tattooing has become a lot more popular and how it has shifted from being a kind of deviant practice to more mainstream. And I think consumer culture and particularly celebrity culture as part of that have been the most important shifts. So in the kind of late 90s into early 2000s, you start getting a lot of celebrities with tattoos, particularly David Beckham, the Manchester United and England footballer who
famous
was
diver,
extremely iconic. Was getting a lot of tattoos. You also got a rise in programs like Miami Ink. So I think the first series of Miami Ink came out around the mid-2000s, and there have been a lot of tattoo programs since then. And in conjunction, the rise in celebrities getting them and the rise in these programs focusing on tattoos kind of demystifies it. People who perhaps wouldn't have even thought about getting tattoos previously see it and think, oh, okay, maybe that is something that is of interest to me. And of course, there's a capitalist element there as well. It allows artists to work. You know, art is an incredibly contested field. It can often be very difficult to make a living as an artist. And those who become tattoo artists, it affords them the opportunity to kind of make a living. And consumer culture is kind of tied in with that. You know, we see it in our media, we see our sports stars. I mentioned my own influence through music, of course, and seeing the musicians that I like with tattoos. So I think, as it is with lots of things, consumer culture has been incredibly significant in shaping attitudes towards tattoo and popularizing the practice over the last 20 to 30 years or so.
How would you comment when you mentioned David Beckham and his skydiver from his back, and for example, the Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson having a very specific tattoo that was linked to his culture? There is a substantial amount of individuals who copied this exactly the same tattoo as these celebrities. So it's quite fascinating, right?
Yeah, there's the winged angel that David Beckham had became very popular. I mean, I criticise in the book actually the notion of tribal tattooing, which is what Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson has got. He is Samoan by heritage, so has got a Samoan tattoo. I don't know whether it has significance to him and to his tribal background, or whether it is kind of just a design of tattooing. And I must be honest, I'm someone who has tribal tattoos. That was what was popular in the late 90s and early 2000s, but it's something that I've since come to learn about and criticize, because, you know, tribal is a kind of, people use the term tribal as if it means one thing, but of course there's a huge number of different tribes around the world that have very distinct tattooing practices that are very meaningful to those tribes. And it gets used as a term for a style of tattooing with no recognition of that, the kind of cultural sensitivity and the cultural importance to indigenous cultures who use tattooing. But like I said, I'm guilty of that as well. I have a number of what would be termed tribal tattoos.
As a matter of fact, I was the one who was also involved in this kind of culture, connected to basketball and hip-hop music. And I remember back in the days that LL Cool J had the two tattoos. One was called a tribal tattoo, but from closer inspection you see that there is a respect word in it. And on the other hand, he has a mic with the XLR cable. I'm amazed the way you linked the tattooing with the body as itself, the product that is a kind of a means to an end, in a sense that you connect the body to the way of the authenticity. Can you explain us this connection?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of us, our identity is constructed through our bodies now. And I do think this has been overemphasized actually in a lot of literature, that we don't tend to stay in careers for a lifetime any longer. You know, so whereas a generation or two ago we might have been a banker, and that would be what would be for life, and that would be quite key to our identity, we often engage in serial monogamy now. So people get divorced and remarried, so their family ties aren't potentially as strong as they might have been a generation or two ago when divorce was less common. So those traditional anchors of identity are kind of eroded. And again, I do think this has been overemphasized, but I think there is an element to it. And we seek out individuality. We seek ways to express our identity, and the body is one of the things that we have control over that, you know, whether we grow our facial hair, what clothes we decide to wear, whether we dye our hair, and so forth. And tattooing is just another way for people to kind of assert their identity, and in particular their individuality, notwithstanding the point that you've just made that sometimes people copy tattoos from one another. I myself have several band tattoos, so obviously there are other people out there who have the exact same tattoos, and that creates a sense of community. But one of the things that really came through from my research, and this actually changed the focus of the research as I was doing it, is this notion of authenticity. It wasn't something that I'd considered before I did my research, and it kept cropping up in my analysis. People kept using terms that it was like they were authentic, or their real selves, and they would demonstrate, and they were truly who they were, because tattoos are obviously broadly permanent. You know, you can have them removed, although typically most people don't go for tattoo removal. And that led me down the road of seeking out the literature around authenticity, because of these phrases kept cropping up, and people would make comparisons that, you know, I can wear a t-shirt and it can say something about me, or I can, you know, dye my hair green or whatever, but those can change. Whereas if I have a tattoo, it's in my skin, it's forever, it's permanent. I'm really demonstrating a commitment to who I am and what I believe in. And they often phrase that in terms of being somehow more authentic than other people who didn't have tattoos.
Can you give us your view of the role of music? You are aware that many of the frontmen of famous bands like Red Hot Chili Peppers, Maroon 5, Prodigy, they were the ones who really built their image on the fact, partly on the fact that they had many tattoos on their body. Can you explain us this phenomenon?
I mentioned my own kind of background and influence by music, heavier music than you've just mentioned. So, you know, Iron Maiden, Metallica, Black Sabbath, things like that, Motley Crue, who were by their nature kind of very rebellious, and a lot of their music reflects that. You know, a lot of rock music is about kind of putting your middle finger up at the man or the system. And so tattoos, and still then had that association more so now, I think, with deviance and with rebelliousness, and that was kind of part of the identity of those bands, and was what attracted me and many other of my peers to tattooing at the time. You know, often if you're into rock music, not always, but you tend to be more left-leaning, I think, more liberal, and no surprise that I found myself within sociology, a very kind of left-leaning and liberal discipline, I think. But, you know, you've just mentioned LL Cool J as well. You know, I think it is a practice that has become much more widespread. But you saw it in, you know, bands like NWA, with people like Dr. Dre, who was obviously in NWA, Eminem as well. So I think it cuts across different musical genres. I think hip-hop has its origins as a kind of rebellious anti-kind of system, anti-man music as well. So I think there's
these messages were very interesting. You mentioned it in your book, the very first tattoos that actually had the message within it. For example, I'm a runaway. It's amazing that even across time you can see similar practices, even in the gangs, even within the hip-hop artists as well.
Yeah, so there is a history of penal tattooing, forced penal tattooing. So this isn't people choosing to get tattooed, but this is people being tattooed either with their crime or as some marker of the state to which they belong to. There's, again, evidence about that without history. But this has often been co-opted by gang members, by kind of people within music as well. I guess this happens with a lot of things, right? You know, when things are forced upon particular groups, or are associated with particular groups, they will often kind of adopt them as a form of resistance. And I think that is true of tattooing and with other things as well.
The demarcation between those pursuing tattooing for genuine quest for authenticity, you touch upon this a little bit, and those doing it because it's intriguing. How has this demarcation evolved within the continued assimilation of tattooing into the mainstream culture?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is something that, again, came out of the research, that this demarcation between people who saw themselves as doing it for kind of authentic and real reasons because it was meaningful, and those who, in their opinion, they felt were only doing it because it was popular, it was the mainstream. So very often David Beckham would get mentioned. David Beckham got mentioned in every interview I did, despite the fact that most of my research was done in the kind of early 2010s. And Cheryl Cole was another one that got mentioned before. Often people say, well, you know, people who get the little fashionable tattoos or who get the David Beckham tattoos aren't getting it because they, you know, genuinely love tattooing or because it's for authentic reasons. It's just for frivolous reasons. But of course, everyone who I interviewed said they were doing it for authentic reasons. No one was saying, oh no, I'm just doing it because it's fashionable. A few did allude to the fact that they'd been, you know, introduced to tattooing through popular culture, and that had influenced them. But then they would frame their stories as being like, oh, but it is, you know, for authentic reasons. It's because it's really me. I thought it was quite interesting that you almost get these kind of sub-communities within tattooing, where there's those who are seen as being more dedicated, doing it for more legitimate reasons, and those who are seen typically by that group as only doing it because it's fashionable, because they've seen it on the TV and so forth.
For those who are interested in the scientific and technical side of things, could you just, we touch upon this a little bit, but you can expand. What was the research design, the methods you used, the quantitative, qualitative? You mentioned interviews.
Yeah, so I did ethnographic research. So I did participant observation in 2 different tattoo studios.
So you literally went to the studios and observed people for how long?
Just hang about in the studios for about 50 to 60 hours in total. Yeah, so several days in each studio. Just hanging about. Quite a few times I got mistaken for someone who worked there because, again, I'm fairly heavily tattooed myself, so I kind of fitted in quite well. I never deliberately kind of made out that I worked there, and often the tattoo artist would explain why I was there. So I'd just kind of hang around. I would listen to people who were getting tattooed, explain why they were getting their tattoos. So again, that formulated some of the ideas for the book that came out of the research. And then I also got to, again, kind of see behind the curtain a bit and listen to tattoo artists talking to one another in the absence of customers. Because, again, I'd been in tattoo studios a lot. I've had a lot of tattooing done on my own body. But, of course, I was a customer, so I only ever saw the kind of customer client, tattoo artist interaction. So I got to see a bit behind the curtain and see tattoo artists interacting with one another without customers being there. I also did what I would say is more opportunistic ethnographic research at music festivals that I happen to be at anyway because I'm a fan of music. So listening to people talk about tattoos to one another. And then I also did interviews. So I did 40 in-depth interviews, a couple with tattoo artists, all of whom were also tattooed, and then the rest all with people who had tattoos, because I was interested in the story of people who were tattooed, not with those who weren't. I was interested in finding out why they had got their tattoos, you know, what had driven their decisions in the choices to not only be tattooed, but what they decided to have tattooed on them.
So what would be the majority of the reasons why most of the people get tattoos?
Understandably, I got a lot of different reasons, but broadly, people tended to be influenced either by their families. And interestingly, the one thing I found is that we started getting to the generation of people who'd been influenced by their parents being tattooed, because you see a surge in popularity of tattooing in the kind of 70s or 80s, and those people are having children, and their own children are seeing their parents with tattoos, which is something that typically hadn't happened in previous generations. So often they would get tattoos that commemorated, brothers, sisters, often loved ones who had passed away, so commemorative tattoos. In a similar vein, people would get tattoos to kind of strengthen bonds of kinship with friends. So shared interests, getting matching tattoos with friends, again, sometimes for friends who had passed away, but often to kind of demonstrate a commitment to friendships or to loved ones, boyfriends, girlfriends, husband, wives, and so forth. Or they would get tattoos around kind of interests, so, demonstrating commitment to their hobbies, to music, so to different musical groups, or to teams, so football teams and so forth were very common. So typically they broadly fit into those three categories. Of reasons why they would choose to get tattoos, but all of it was tied into this notion of kind of expressing their individuality and their authenticity, and their commitment to their own kind of selves. There was one I remember as being notable who'd had a tattoo with a friend who they were no longer friends with. They'd fallen out after having the tattoos. But even so, it represented for them the strength of that bond at the time, because even though they weren't friends any longer, there was a long period of their lives where they had been friends and they could reflect back on that experience fondly.
There are certain terms that are within your title of your book, like identity and authenticity. Living in what Taylor terms the age of authenticity, how do tattoos enable individuals to fulfill quests for the authenticity, and what role does the modern tattoo figurations play in the context? And you can also explain the theoretical part of the term figurations as well.
Okay, so I'll start with authenticity. As I said, this wasn't a concept that was in my mind when I started the research, and what I was finding led me to look for what had been written about this. And authenticity in academic research, at least within social sciences, is quite a contested term, whether we actually have any such thing as authenticity, whether we can be authentic people, or the sociologist Irving Goffman, for example, says there's no such thing as a central sense of self. We just perform roles in different situations. But for my respondents, the idea that tattooing demonstrated authenticity for them was clear. For them, they felt that there was such a thing as authenticity. And I think more broadly and culturally, we're quite obsessed with this idea of authenticity. So in the book, I use the example of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is the real thing. And I use the example of the computer game Grand Theft Auto. There was an interview with one of the makers of the game who talks about how some of the voices in the games were from people who were actually gang members in gangs in America, and that lent authenticity for the game. I think culturally and within consumer culture, where we are somewhat obsessed with this idea of authenticity. You buy an authentic item when you go on holiday. It's not just a tat. It's really authentic. It's from a particular culture, or it's been made by a particular person, and so forth. So it is a contested term within academia, but I think more broadly in society, there is something about this idea of authenticity, and that we are authentic, that when we are having relations and connections with people, that people who are really who they say that they are, that they're not being duplicitous and lying to us. So this was key for my respondents, and this idea of showing you're authentic and showing that you're really who you are. Tattoos was important to them for this because of the permanence. As I said earlier, you have this tattoo. It shows your commitment to yourself. It shows your commitment to your friends, your family members, your hobbies, the bands that you're into, whatever it may be. And because it can't be erased, it shows that you're not a fake fan, you're not a fake person, you are real, you are genuine, and therefore you are authentic. In terms of figurations, so this is a bit more technical, a bit more theoretical. I won't turn it into too much of a lecture, but this is a theory developed by Norbert Elias, who wanted to demonstrate the kind of interrelations between people at the small and the large scale. So a figuration can be just us. We're in a figuration now, just the two of us. But you can trace that up into a kind of global scale to the way that we are all interconnected in some way. And increasingly we're interconnected with people that we never meet, because of the modern world. If you think about the university, for example, we're connected with administrators, we're connected with the Office of the Vice Chancellor, the Office for Students, the NUS, with lots of people that often we never meet. But we know that they somehow have an impact on our lives. I felt figurational sociology was kind of very compelling in terms of the way it represented the different forms of connections that we have at any given time. So I mentioned friends and family. These are forms of figuration that, of course, impact on one another as well. And our figurations can change throughout life, and we are involved in lots of different figurations at any given time. Family, work, health systems, whatever it may be. I find it quite a compelling theory because of the way it can be applied in so many different contexts.
It's amazing when you said this, and most of all of us, we are in certain kind of a quest for truth in this life. And I'm amazed the way you are really put yourself on the very frontier of both the empirical part of your research and then the theoretical, the ontological and the epistemological part of the whole phenomenon that you are trying to analyze. Can you give me a little bit comment on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. Unless we're unlucky, we tend to research things that we're interested in. But it also means we often have to confront ourselves. And certainly that was the case for my tattooing. I mentioned that I have a fair bit of what's called tribal tattooing. And I increasingly have discomfort in that, having kind of learned what I've learned about indigenous cultures and their tattooing practices. And I feel a discomfort with that because of, you learn about yourself and you have to confront it. And, I said I first started getting tattoos because I felt it was quite rebellious, and it kind of reflected that sense of who I was, that I was kind of quite left-leaning, against the man, anti-capitalist. This was reflected in the music that I listened to. But I think even at the time I was getting tattooed, you started to see the increase in popularity of tattooing, and that has exacerbated significantly so now. There's no definitive statistics on tattooing, and even though a lot of my respondents would say, everyone's got one now, the statistics that we do have suggest it's still under 50% of the population, in the UK at least. It may be different in other areas of the world. So it is still a minority practice, but it's a fairly significant minority. You do see a lot of people with tattooing now. So that kind of rebellious nature and so forth becomes challenged as well, as you recognise it's a lot more kind of mainstream and popular and perhaps cool than you thought. But
on the other hand, also one fact from your book, and between the 2003 and 2013, 173% of the new tattoo shops opened in Britain alone.
Yeah, I think that's one way to trace the popularity of it. I mentioned that there were only 3 tattoo studios in Cardiff. It's a very big city.
1999.
Yeah, when I first had mine. But in Canterbury, which was the city where the university where I did my postgraduate studies in, very small city, population of about 40,000. And there were half a dozen or so tattoo studios there. And obviously, these tattoo studios don't emerge unless there's a demand for the practice, because, you can't start a business unless you know that you're going to have customers. So that's looking at, I guess, business databases and the registration of tattoo studios is one way that you can trace the actual increase in popularity of the practice.
One more question. I know you're a very busy man, a very tight schedule.
No problem.
Double frontier meaning of tattoos. This is something that you end your book with, or one of the chapters. The concept of double frontier meaning for tattoos is fascinating. Can you share more about how individuals navigate between the personal, private meaning for themselves and the public display aspect of their tattoos.
Yeah, so there were two aspects to this that really came up. The first is that in a lot of the things written about tattooing already, it was either this is a deviant, non-normative practice and it's problematic, or this is a perfectly normal practice that's part of identity formation. And there wasn't really much consideration of how those two things could overlap. And it's similar to that overlap between the very private meaning people could have for tattoos and the kind of public meaning and how people can read those things. So very often people would have stories around their tattoos that could be very personal and meaningful to them, and that they would reveal to people who they felt comfortable with. But if it was people that they didn't know as well, they could give a more general remark about why they'd got it, that they didn't have to get into that kind of deep, meaningful, perhaps very personal, particularly where it's kind of commemoration to people who've kind of passed away and so forth. So it had this double-fronted meaning of kind of what it meant to them, but how they could explain it to others that might look on it less favourably, or who they had just less connection to and didn't want to get into that depth with. But also for some people, they talked about it that, you know, they would have tattoos that showed them to be quite rebellious, and that they could speak to their nature as someone who kind of didn't go with the flow and was against kind of whatever mainstream culture was, that they were kind of different or perhaps members of subcultures. But often they would say, but I've got them in places that can be hidden. So, you know, if I get a job in a bank or in an office and I have to hide them, then I can wear a shirt and that will allow me to hide them as well. So they could be quite deviant in terms of speaking against kind of mainstream culture, but also they could still kind of be hidden and be engaged in more normative aspects of society, if that makes sense.
Dr. Rees, thank you so much for stopping by and talking to us about this very interesting topic. I hope I'm going to see you sometime soon again to talk about some different topic connected to sociology as well.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Hopefully it's of interest to the listeners or viewers.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.